Good Sabbath. Let's bow our heads once again. Heavenly Father, as we open your word, we pray that you will speak to us through it. Shine your light into our hearts to reveal anything there that needs to be exposed. God, I pray that as we come face to face with your word today, that we will be led to confess our failures before you, that we might receive forgiveness. It's through the blood of Jesus Christ that we can receive all the blessings that you have for us. And today we claim this blood upon us. Bless us as we hear you today. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Show me a man who can control his tongue, and I'll show you a man who can do anything that he sets his mind to. But taming the tongue is easier said than done, and even as I say this, I realize the challenge that faces me simply in sharing this message with you this morning. Let my own tongue testify against itself today and be the first to confess its recklessness and thoughtlessness even in this moment. I can remember a couple of times this week where the tongue went its own direction, and my wife can probably think of a couple other times to add to that. James says, "No man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil full of deadly poison." You might sooner subdue Mount St. Helens or keep Kilauea from spewing her lava than keep your tongue from speaking when it shouldn't. Sure, it might lie dormant every now and then, but under the right circumstances, given the right conditions, there's bound to be an eruption. The human tongue is a force to be reckoned with. The temptation to speak out is so powerful it often overcomes us before we even have a chance to identify it as a temptation. Maybe it'd be better to call it an impulse, seemingly beyond control. The tongue knows no challenge that it cannot overcome. It has an opinion on every subject, an answer for every question, an explanation for every circumstance, a solution for every problem, an objection to every argument, a defense for every accusation, a reason for every failure, a criticism for every mistake, a sarcastic response, a snappy comeback, a swear word whenever they seem fitting to the occasion. Without even thinking, the tongue always seems to know what to say. But therein lies the problem, because frequently the words that come out of our mouths spend very little time in our brains before they make their exit. And it's unfortunate because an unruly tongue rarely improves any situation, and it frequently makes matters worse. Words are very powerful tools, but when they are used thoughtlessly, they are much better suited for demolition than they are for construction. And our God is in the construction business. He's a creator, a builder, a designer, a renovator. God takes what is broken down and he fixes it up again. He takes what is old and he makes it brand new. And he wants you to join him in that business. In 1 Thessalonians 5:11, Paul says that we are to encourage one another and build each other up. Our words, those powerful tools that God has put into our mouths, it is his intention that we use them to encourage one another, to build each other up. And to do so requires that we put more care and thought into the words that we use, to control the words that come out of our mouths. But the tongue wants to run wild. The tongue wants to be heard, and it doesn't really care who gets knocked down in the process. The situation's worse because according to James, your tongue controls the rest of your being. As goes the tongue, so goes the body, and so goes the soul. As James says in James chapter 3, verses 3 and 4. Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. Look also at ships. Although they are so large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder, wherever the pilot desires. The tongue is that little bit in the horse's mouth. It's like that rudder on the back of the ship. It's very small, but it determines the course that will be taken. And the tongue, if not controlled, will steer you down a path that you don't want to be on. Verse 6, James says, the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire by hell. The words that come out of your mouth, the types of words that you use, the degree to which you are able or unable to control your tongue will give you insight into the condition of your hearts. As Jesus says, Matthew chapter 12, 34 and 35, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Remember that whenever we say something that we say, well, I didn't mean it. Jesus says we speak out of the abundance of our heart, and we may regret the things that we say, but there's something in us that gives rise to those impulsive statements that we make. Jesus says a good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good things, and an evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth evil things. The evil things that we say come out of an evil that resides somewhere within our heart. The real problem isn't the tongue, it's in the heart. Our inner desire, our passions, our emotions, that's really where the trouble begins. James says in chapter 1, verse 14, it says, each one is tempted when he's drawn away by his own desires and enticed. It's the desires of the heart that give rise to the temptations within us that lead us astray, and our inner desires cause the emotions in us that seem to just take over and drive us and almost impulsively, instinctively cause us to say things that we shouldn't, whether we realize it or not. And I think within each and every one of us, it may take a different form, but there's that impulse, that inner drive to speak when perhaps we would be better served to listen. James gives us this counsel in chapter 1, verse 19. So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. Let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak. Yet so often we find ourselves slow to hear and swift to speak. We speak much more easily than we do listen. And it can take on all sorts of forms when somebody is sharing with us their life circumstances, their challenges, their difficulties. We are much more quick to respond and to offer a solution than perhaps just to listen and to hear and to understand not just the words that are being said, but the emotions that are being conveyed, the pain, the heartache, the joy that might be expressed. The situation likely gets worse when we feel that somebody's opinion, their way of doing things, does not agree with the one inside of me. And then, rather than taking that time to listen and to hear and fully understand the situation, that desire to speak, to correct, to give instruction, to give advice that we just know is going to solve every problem. It's going to turn their life around. James says, "My beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak." But why is it that we are so quick to speak? Is it perhaps because there's something inside of us that just needs to be heard, that just needs to be right? If I keep silent, who's going to know about all this wisdom that I have inside of me? We think that by speaking we come across as wise, as somebody who knows things, as somebody who's got things all together. Sometimes when we open our mouths, we actually make the situation much worse. I'm reminded of a word of wisdom spoken many years ago. It's better to keep your mouth shut, to be thought of as a fool, than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. We think that by speaking we are going to be revered, respected, honored as being wise. James says we would be wise to control the tongue, to listen before we speak. We may not even think that what we're saying is harmful. It may not be intentional. It may not be deliberate. It may be with the intention of being caring and comforting. But without thinking about our words carefully, listening to the words being communicated to us, putting a greater priority in what someone is telling me than in what I have to say to them, whatever words I do say may fall on deaf ears. They may indicate to the person I'm speaking to that I really just don't know their situation. I don't care about them. There's a lot of wisdom, a lot of power in very carefully chosen words. I'm reminded of Jesus in the temple one morning. He got a crowd of people gathered around him, listening to him eagerly as they often did, while a hostile group of scribes and Pharisees come in and interrupt their conversation. They confront Jesus because they had caught a woman in the very act of adultery. And believing that they could induce Jesus to blaspheme the law of Moses, they question him. What should be done with this woman? Moses says that she ought to be stoned to death. Well, what do you say, Jesus? So many things that Jesus might have said in that moment. And we ought to pay careful attention to how Jesus responds in this moment. The wisdom of God that is evident in Jesus is worthy of imitation. So many things that Jesus could have said off the top of his head. I mean, think about it. What would you have said? What could you have said? Feelings that rise up maybe. The irritation with these scribes and Pharisees. Who do they think that they are? So many things that Jesus could have said. But before speaking, he silently stooped down and began writing in the dirt. John says it's almost as if he didn't hear them. Just ignored them. Ignored their question. But finally, when pressed for an answer, come on, Jesus, tell us. The words that Jesus spoke were very simple and yet incredibly profound. Whoever among you is without sin, let him throw the first stone. Such a profound statement. And coupled with whatever Jesus wrote in the dirt on that day, it sent the scribes and the Pharisees slinking away, trying to escape the condemnation of their own consciences. Jesus hardly had to say anything at all. There's so much power in a few carefully chosen words. And even when the crowd had cleared and Jesus found himself alone with this woman who had been caught in her sin, again, so many things that Jesus could have said to her. And if she was standing here in front of us, I can only imagine what we might try to say. Give her a lecture about her lifestyle and the sin that she's committed. Maybe give her a Bible study about the 10 Commandments and the responsibility of people who claim to be followers of God. So many things that could be said to this woman who stands under condemnation. But Jesus' response to her, so simple and yet so profound. He says, "Where are your accusers? Does nobody condemn you? Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." Now, that last sentence might be our favorite part of what Jesus says. We like that. I mean, we might want to elaborate on that. But we bypass the simplicity and the profundity of Jesus' previous statement. Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. Such simplicity. Born out of divine wisdom. James, his counsel to us. James chapter 3, verse 2. We stumble in many things. It's important for us to be aware of. We make many mistakes. And if anyone does not stumble in word, he's a perfect man. Think about that. Essentially, what James is saying is what I began this message with. A man who can control his tongue, he can do anything. He's perfect. He's able to bridle the whole body. If you feel the struggle with sin in your body, well, perhaps one good place to start is trying to bridle the tongue. Because the words that we speak have such power over the direction we will go. When we speak hastily, allow our tongue to just say whatever comes to mind, it demonstrates within us an extreme lack of self-control. And that self-control is not just existent in the tongue, but everywhere else in the body. What are we to do, though? James says that no man can tame the tongue. It's an unruly evil. The tongue wants to lead us astray. It wants to carry us off. It's why it's so hard to control. It's that moment before you can even think about what you're saying, it's already out. You can't take it back. No man can tame the tongue. Yet James says we should do it. We should seek to do it. How can we do that? How is it possible? Galatians chapter 5 gives us the fruit of the Holy Spirit. One of those fruits is self-control. It's only by the grace of God, through the power of the Spirit, by a supernatural act of God, that we may take control of this tongue and learn to use our ears and to listen rather than to speak whatever comes to mind. Maybe as you're listening to this message, you can think of time recently, this last week, like myself, where those words just came shooting out. Didn't finish listening to what somebody had said to you. Interrupted them mid-sentence because whatever they were saying was not right. It was clearly wrong. And the tongue just had to correct. Or maybe it was something that seems less harmful. Somebody sharing their life story with you, an experience they're going through, and feeling that you had to offer words of wisdom to them, that that's what they were looking for. You moved past the emotions and the experience that they were going through, and you went straight to the advice and the counsel, the wisdom, what I would do in this situation. Maybe you had a difficult time in traffic this week. That early morning traffic sometimes can get the best of us. Somebody cut you off, and out came some expression of anger. You can think of a time sometime, we can likely all think of a time this week when our tongue led us somewhere it shouldn't have. How do we handle those situations? Jesus says that those things come out of the abundance of our heart. There's something inside of us that leads us to value our own opinion. And we can confess, "Dear Jesus, my tongue got away from me. I need your help. This is beyond my control, seemingly. Every time the situation arises, I burst out. Ask for Jesus' help. Lord, change my heart. Give me a new spirit. Take control of my tongue. It's really all I have for us this morning. It's a challenge that I've wrestled with greatly this week, thinking about this problem as James describes it. It's an unruly evil, the human tongue. It's a problem that has a lot more questions sometimes than it does answers, except for the simple realization that if we're going to learn to do as Jesus did, to care for others, to listen, to hear, and to be slow to speak, to not allow our emotions to control us, to act on whims, we need his help, his strength. We need to turn to him. So when in those moments, when the tongue takes control, let it be a reminder that we need to turn back to Jesus. Give him control. Give him power. And let the love of Christ take over those emotions. Lord Jesus, we recognize that inside of us lurks a deadly poison, and often we encounter it so frequently that we almost ignore it at times, brush it off, treat it as though it's not really a big deal. But like that bit in the horse's mouth, like that rudder on the ship, we know that the Bible tells us that the words that we say will steer us. It might be towards destruction, but it might also be to your glory. Lord, I just pray that you will take control of our hearts, take control of our emotions and our minds, take control of our tongues, that we might use the words that you've given us to encourage one another and to build each other up. May self be set aside, and may those around us find that we care about them and demonstrate love, because your grace, your Spirit, flows through us and touches their hearts. Father, forgive us for where we have fallen short. Forgive us for the unruliness of our tongue. Change our hearts, change our minds. This is our prayer. In Jesus' name.